Welcome. Be sure to like and subscribe for more scary stories, or I will come for you. I'd like to extend a thank you to Jordy and Larry Adams for joining the Curator's Disciples. Your viewership is very much appreciated. If anyone would like early access to my latest stories and an ad-free listening experience, consider becoming one of the Curator's Disciples. The link is in the description below. Story number 1. Welcome to Snuff Inc. by the Curator. I never thought my life would turn out this way. Growing up, I was a happy kid. My parents were loving and supportive. We lived in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. My dad worked as a mechanic, and my mom was a school teacher. They worked hard to give me and my younger sister, Emily, a good life. I was a pretty average student, not the brightest, but I got by. I had a few close friends, and we spent our days playing video games and dreaming about the future. After high school, I decided to go to college. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life, so I majored in business. I figured it was a safe bet, something that could lead to a decent job. College was a blur of classes, part-time jobs, and late-night study sessions. It was also where I met Karen. She was a sophomore, majoring in marketing. We met at a party, and I was immediately drawn to her. She was smart, funny, and beautiful. We started dating, and before long, we were inseparable. We graduated, got decent jobs, and eventually got married. I landed a job as an account manager at a small marketing firm, and Karen got a job as an executive assistant at a large accounting firm. We bought a house, got a dog, and settled into what I thought would be a perfect life. But things started to change. Karen became more and more distant. She was always busy with work, always stressed. We fought a lot, and the fights were getting worse. The first time she hit me, I was in shock. It was during a particularly nasty argument about her long hours and the late-night calls from her boss. She slapped me across the face, and I just stood there, stunned. She apologized later, blaming the stress of her job, but it happened again and again. It wasn't just slaps. Sometimes she threw things, whatever was within reach. A lamp, a book, once even a plate that shattered against the wall. Each time, she would apologize, and I would forgive her. I loved her, and I kept hoping things would get better. But they didn't. The physical abuse was bad enough, but the emotional abuse was worse. She would call me names, belittle me, make me feel worthless. I tried to talk to her, to tell her how much it hurt, but she just brushed it off, saying I was being too sensitive. I felt trapped, unable to leave, but also unable to stay. Then I found out about the affair. I came home early from work one day and found her in bed with another man. It was like a punch to the gut. I confronted her, and she didn't even try to deny it. She said she was unhappy, that she needed more than I could give her. I was devastated. I couldn't understand how the woman I loved, the woman I had married, could betray me like this. We fought constantly after that. The arguments were louder, more violent. She would hit me, throw things at me, and I would just take it. I didn't know what else to do. I felt like my life was falling apart, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The night she destroyed my mother's urn was the breaking point. We were in the middle of another screaming match, and she was throwing things at me. I was trying to stay calm, trying to keep from escalating the fight, but then she grabbed the urn. It was my most treasured possession, the last physical connection I had to my mother. When she threw it against the wall, and it shattered, my mother's ashes scattering across the floor, something inside me snapped. I was beyond angry. I was in a blind rage. I couldn't believe she had done something so cruel, so heartless. She stormed out of the house, leaving me alone with my shattered heart and my mother's ashes. I fell to my knees, sobbing, trying to gather the ashes, but it was hopeless. The pain and anger were overwhelming. I felt like I was drowning in my emotions, unable to breathe, unable to think. I didn't know what to do. My only outlet in life was my computer. I spent hours browsing the web, watching YouTube videos, anything to escape the harsh reality of my life. That night, I decided to explore the dark web. I had heard about it, but never really ventured there. I fired up my browser and connected through a secure, anonymous network. The dark web was a maze of hidden sites, some harmless, some disturbing. I clicked through various links, unsure of what I was looking for, but hoping to find something that could distract me from my pain. After an hour of aimless browsing, I stumbled upon a site that made my blood run cold. It was a forum for people interested in snuff films. The site was called Welcome to Snuff Inc. The front page had links to videos of actual murders, each more gruesome than the last. I was repulsed, but I couldn't look away. Curiosity and anger drove me deeper into the site. There was a section for custom requests. For a price, you could submit details about someone you wanted to see killed, and they would make a personalized video. It was insane, something out of a horror movie. But in my rage, it seemed like an answer. Without thinking, I clicked on the form and began filling it out. I entered Karen's details, her name, age, where she worked, and what she looked like. My hands were shaking as I typed. When I got to the part where it asked for the type of death, I paused. I remembered the way she had shattered my mother's urn, the way she had made me feel worthless. I wrote that I wanted a brutal death, something that would make her pay for what she had done. I submitted the form and sat back, my heart pounding. I felt a mix of fear and excitement. Part of me couldn't believe I had done it, but another part felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. I logged off and went to bed, hoping to put it out of my mind. Weeks went by, and nothing happened. Karen continued her affair, and we continued to fight. My anger slowly turned into something else. Guilt. I couldn't get the image of the form I had filled out on the dark web out of my mind. It haunted me day and night. Karen's disappearance that day was just the beginning of my torment. Every evening when she came home from work, my mind was plagued by the thought that something terrible could happen to her because of me. Every time she went out with her friends or stayed late at the office, I was consumed by anxiety. What if they found her? What if my request was taken seriously? The guilt started to eat away at me. I couldn't concentrate at work. My productivity plummeted. I found myself staring blankly at my computer screen, unable to focus on the simplest of tasks. My colleagues noticed the change in me. They asked if I was okay, but I couldn't tell them the truth. How could I explain the dark secret that was gnawing at my soul? My nights were filled with nightmares. I would dream of Karen, her face twisted in fear and pain, calling out to me for help. In these dreams, I was always too late, arriving just in time to see her die in some horrific way. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I started avoiding sleep, staying up late into the night, trying to keep the nightmares at bay. The guilt was overwhelming. I tried to push it down, to bury it beneath layers of denial and rationalization. I told myself that it was just a fantasy, that nothing would come of it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I had set something in motion, and I couldn't stop it. I started drinking more, hoping to numb the pain. Every night, I would pour myself a glass of whiskey, then another and another, but the alcohol only made things worse. It dulled the edge of my guilt, but it didn't make it go away. Instead, it brought my emotions closer to the surface, making me more volatile, more prone to outbursts of anger and tears. One night, after a particularly heavy drinking session, I broke down and called my brother. We hadn't spoken much since my mother's death, but I needed someone to talk to. I poured out my heart to him, telling him about the affair, the fights, and the overwhelming guilt I was feeling. I didn't tell him about the dark web, though. That was a secret too dark to share. He listened patiently, offering words of comfort and advice. He told me that I needed to take care of myself, that I needed to find a way to move forward. He suggested that I see a therapist, that talking to a professional might help me sort through my feelings. I agreed, even though I knew that no therapist could erase the guilt that was tearing me apart. I made an appointment with a therapist and started attending sessions regularly. The therapist was kind and understanding, but it was hard to open up about the darkest parts of my soul. I told her about the affair, about the fights, about the broken urn and the shattered dreams. She listened and offered advice, but I kept the darkest secret hidden. As the weeks turned into months, I started to feel a little more at peace. The therapist helped me to see that I wasn't entirely to blame for the state of my marriage. Karen had her faults too, and our relationship had been broken long before that fateful night. I began to consider the possibility of divorce. Maybe we weren't meant to be together. Maybe it was time to move on. I started looking into divorce proceedings, researching lawyers, and trying to figure out how to untangle our lives. It wasn't easy, but it felt like the right thing to do. I started imagining a future without Karen, a future where I could find happiness and peace. The guilt was still there, but it was starting to feel a little more manageable. Then one day, Karen didn't come home from work. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she was with her lover, or maybe she had decided to stay late at the office. But as the hours passed, I started to worry. I tried calling her, but her phone was off. Panic set in, a cold, creeping dread that settled in the pit of my stomach. I remembered what I had done on the dark web. My heart raced as I logged back into the site, hoping to find some reassurance that it was all a joke. But when I checked my email, my worst fears were confirmed. There was a message from an anonymous account. With shaking hands, I opened it. There was a link to a video. I hesitated, but I had to know. I clicked the link, and the video started to play. The video opened with a dimly lit room. Karen was tied to a chair in the center, her face bruised and bloodied. Her eyes were wide with fear, tears streaming down her cheeks. My heart sank as I realized what was happening. There was a man off camera, his voice cold and menacing. He was asking her questions about what she had done, telling her she needed to repent for her sins. "Why did you betray your husband?" the man asked. Karen sobbed, her voice shaking as she tried to speak. I don't know," she stammered. "I'm sorry. Please, let me go." The man laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Sorry isn't good enough. You need to be punished for what you've done." He stepped into the frame, and I saw that he was holding a machete. My stomach turned as I realized what was about to happen. He approached Karen slowly, savoring her terror. "Your hands," he said, lifting the knife. "These hands are not clean. They need to be removed." Karen screamed as he brought the machete down, severing her right hand. Blood spurted from the wound, and she writhed in agony, her screams echoing in the small room. Her cries were raw and guttural, a primal expression of pain that pierced through me. The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing every detail of her suffering. The veins bulging in her neck, the tendons in her face straining as she screamed, the blood pooling on the floor beneath her. The man didn't stop. He moved to her left hand, repeating the gruesome act. Each swing of the machete was slow and deliberate, ensuring maximum pain. Karen's eyes rolled back in her head as she fainted from the agony, but a swift kick to her side jolted her back to consciousness. Her cries were heart-wrenching, a sound of pure pain and desperation. I felt sick, my head spinning as I watched. The man wasn't finished. He produced a can of petrol, dousing Karen with the liquid. She was sobbing uncontrollably, begging for mercy, but it was clear there would be none. The man struck a match, holding it up for a moment before tossing it onto Karen. The flames engulfed her instantly, and her screams reached a new level of horror. She thrashed in the chair, trying to escape the fire, but it was useless. The flames consumed her, turning her to ash. The camera stayed focused on her face, capturing the moment the life drained from her eyes. The man spoke one last time, his voice filled with a chilling satisfaction. "This is what happens when you betray your family." The video ended with a close-up of the charred remains, a haunting reminder of the brutal punishment Karen had endured. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My wife was dead, and it was all my fault. I had done this. In my rage, I had condemned her to a brutal death. The guilt was overwhelming. I wanted to go to the police, to confess everything, but I was too scared. What would they do to me? How could I live with this? Weeks passed, and I tried to go on with my life, but I couldn't escape the images of Karen's death. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her screams. The regret was too much to bear. I didn't know how I would live with this for the rest of my life. I tried to distract myself with work, burying myself in projects and tasks, but nothing could take my mind off what I had done. Every time I saw a woman who resembled Karen, my heart would race, and I'd feel a surge of panic. I started drinking more, hoping to drown out the memories, but the alcohol only made things worse. My thoughts would spiral, and I'd end up in a dark place, consumed by guilt and self-loathing. Eventually, I decided to seek help. I found a therapist and began attending sessions regularly. I didn't tell him everything at first, just that I was struggling with intense guilt and anxiety. He listened patiently, offering advice and coping strategies. But no matter what he said, nothing could alleviate the crushing weight of my guilt. During one session, I finally broke down and told him everything. I confessed to filling out the form on the dark web, the video I had received, and the torment I had been living with since. He was shocked, of course, but he remained professional. He urged me to go to the police, to confess my crime and seek justice for Karen. I left the session feeling more conflicted than ever. I knew he was right. I couldn't live with this guilt forever, and Karen deserved justice. But the thought of turning myself in, of facing the consequences of my actions, was terrifying. For days, I wrestled with the decision. I would sit in front of my computer, staring at the screen, trying to summon the courage to act. I started writing a letter, explaining everything that had happened, hoping that putting it down on paper would help me find some clarity. The process was painful, forcing me to confront my actions and the consequences they had wrought. In the end, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't keep running from my guilt. I couldn't keep living a lie. I printed out the letter, along with screenshots of the email and the video, and gathered all the evidence I had. With a heavy heart, I made my way to the local police station. The officers at the front desk were taken aback when I handed them the envelope, explaining that I needed to confess to a crime. They led me into a small interrogation room where I recounted everything in excruciating detail. I showed them the video, the email, the screenshots. They listened in stunned silence, taking notes and asking questions. As I spoke, I felt a strange sense of relief. The burden of my guilt was slowly lifting, replaced by a cold, hard reality. I knew I would be arrested, that I would face trial and likely spend the rest of my life in prison. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. They placed me in handcuffs and led me to a holding cell. The walls were cold and gray, the air thick with the scent of despair. I sat on the small cot, my mind racing. I thought about Karen, about the life we could have had if things had been different. I thought about my mother and how disappointed she would be in me. I thought about the future, about the long years I would spend behind bars, paying for my crime. Now, as I sit in my cell, I have nothing but time to reflect on my actions. I decided to keep a journal, to document my thoughts and feelings, to try and make sense of everything that has happened. Writing has become my only solace, a way to process my guilt and come to terms with the reality of my situation. To anyone reading this, I hope my story serves as a cautionary tale. Anger and revenge can lead you down a dark path, one from which there may be no return. I made a terrible mistake, and now I am paying the price. I will carry this guilt with me for the rest of my life, a constant reminder of the man I have become. This is my confession, my penance. I cannot undo what I have done, but I can try to find some measure of peace in accepting my fate. I am truly sorry for what I have done, and I hope that one day I can find forgiveness. Story number 2. Big Pharma is on the dark web. Part 2. By the curator. I have to get this off my chest, so here it goes. If you've been following my posts, you know about Aglera Pharmaceuticals and their shady dealings on the dark web. I thought I'd seen the worst of it when I found out about Vypexia, the drug that made people clinically insane. But what I found next is even more horrifying. Before diving deeper into what happened, let me tell you a bit about myself. My name is Jake, and I've always had a knack for uncovering the truth. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other's business, but I always felt there was more to the world than what was on the surface. My dad was a journalist who often got in trouble for poking his nose where it didn't belong. He taught me to question everything and to never take things at face value. After high school, I moved to the city for college, majoring in journalism. I was passionate about investigative reporting, inspired by my dad's work. But after he passed away unexpectedly, I dropped out and fell into a deep depression. I spent a few years drifting, working odd jobs and barely getting by. Eventually, I found solace in the dark corners of the internet, where I started digging into conspiracy theories and uncovering hidden truths. That's how I stumbled upon Aglera Pharmaceuticals. My curiosity and desire for justice drove me to investigate them further. I knew they were up to no good, but what I discovered about their experiments on homeless people was beyond anything I could have imagined. It all started when I got a tip from an anonymous user on a dark web forum. They claimed Aglera was conducting live experiments on homeless people, testing a new drug with unpredictable and often fatal side effects. At first, I didn't believe it. I mean, it sounded like something straight out of a conspiracy theory. But the user sent me a link to a hidden site where I could see it for myself. I hesitated before clicking the link. Part of me didn't want to see it, but my curiosity got the better of me. The site was a live feed, showing a dimly lit room with two men inside. They were both homeless, Judging by their ragged clothes and unkempt appearance, they looked scared and confused, like they didn't know how they got there. The room had a glass wall on one side, and behind it, I could see people in lab coats. They were preparing something, and it didn't take long for me to figure out what it was. One of the scientists came into the room with a syringe and approached the first man. The first man, his eyes wide with terror, tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. His ragged clothes clung to his gaunt frame, and his body visibly trembled. The scientist grabbed his arm with a cold, clinical detachment, and I could see the man's muscles straining as he tried to pull away. The needle glinted ominously under the harsh fluorescent lights. The scientist didn't hesitate. He plunged the needle into the man's arm, and I could see the man's face contort in pain and fear. His body went rigid for a moment, then started to shake uncontrollably. His eyes rolled back, and he fell to the floor, his limbs jerking violently. The scientist watched dispassionately, taking notes on a clipboard. The second man, witnessing this, began to panic. He screamed and tried to run, but the room was too small. The scientist approached him next, syringe in hand. The second man's screams turned to desperate pleas, but the scientist ignored him. He jabbed the needle into the man's arm, and within seconds, the second man's demeanor changed. He started clawing at his skin, his nails leaving deep gouges as he tore at himself. The first man's convulsions grew worse. He lay on the cold, hard floor, his body twitching and spasming. His eyes were wide open, but there was no recognition in them. It was like he was trapped inside his own body, aware of what was happening, but powerless to stop it. Suddenly, his body went limp. For a moment, I thought he was dead. Then, he started to move again, but it was different this time. His movements were jerky and uncoordinated, like a puppet on strings. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. He fell back to the floor, his limbs flailing uselessly. His face contorted in pain and humiliation as he lost control of his bodily functions. The smell hit me even through the screen, and I saw the scientists wrinkle their noses. But they didn't intervene. They just kept taking notes, observing his suffering with detached interest. The second man's condition was even more horrifying. His screams turned to incoherent babbling as he clawed at his skin, ripping it open in several places. Blood ran down his arms, mingling with the dirt and grime on his skin. He seemed to be in a state of utter panic, his eyes darting around the room as if he was seeing things that weren't there. Then, his gaze fixed on the first man. There was a moment of eerie stillness, and then he lunged. He attacked the first man with a ferocity that was both terrifying and heartbreaking. He punched and kicked him, each blow landing with sickening force. The first man tried to protect himself, but his arms wouldn't respond. He was utterly defenseless. The second man's rage was unrelenting. He pummeled the first man with a fury that seemed almost superhuman. The sound of bones breaking echoed through the room. I could see the first man's face crumple in pain, his eyes pleading for mercy. But there was none to be found. The second man's attacks grew more frenzied. His hands were a mess of broken fingers, but he didn't stop. He grabbed the first man's head and started smashing it against the glass wall, over and over with a sickening thud each time. Blood splattered the glass, and I could see the first man's skull begin to crack. The sight was beyond gruesome. The first man's eyes went dull, and I knew he was gone. But the second man didn't stop. He kept smashing the lifeless body into the glass, his own blood mixing with his victim's. The scientists watched, their expressions impassive. They didn't intervene, even as the scene descended into complete carnage. Finally, the second man's strength gave out. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. His head lolled to the side, and I saw the life drain out of his eyes. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the equipment. The scientists continued to take notes, as if this was just another day at work. I sat there, stunned. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. The brutality, the indifference, it was beyond anything I could comprehend. I saved the video footage and reported it to the police, hoping against hope that they would take it seriously. But they brushed it off as fake footage, another pharma conspiracy. They didn't even look at the evidence I brought. I don't know what to do now. I feel so helpless. I've seen things I can't unsee, and I know there's more out there. Aglara Pharmaceuticals is getting away with murder, and no one seems to care. I'm disgusted and terrified. How can something like this happen, and no one does anything about it? I don't know, but I can't just sit back and do nothing. I have to find a way to stop them, somehow. That's all for now. If anyone has any ideas or can help, please reach out. This has to stop. After I posted about what I saw, a few people reached out to me. Most of them were just as horrified as I was. Some suggested I go to the media, but I wasn't sure if that would do any good. The police didn't believe me, so why would anyone else? But I couldn't just let it go. I spent hours every day trying to find more information about Aglara Pharmaceuticals and their experiments. I found out they had a history of shady dealings, but nothing as bad as what I saw. It seemed like they were getting bolder, testing the limits of what they could get away with. I tried contacting some journalists, but most of them didn't take me seriously. They thought I was just another conspiracy nut. One journalist, though, seemed interested. He said he would look into it and get back to me. I didn't have much hope, but it was better than nothing. A few days later, the journalist contacted me. He said he had found some interesting information. Apparently, Aglara Pharmaceuticals had been under investigation before, but nothing ever came of it. He thought there might be some truth to my story and wanted to meet in person to discuss it. We met at a coffee shop in the city. I showed him the video footage, and he was visibly shaken. He said he would try to get it published, but it would be difficult. Aglara had a lot of influence and could easily shut down any attempts to expose them. The journalist kept his word and tried to get the story published. He faced a lot of pushback, but eventually, one small news outlet agreed to run it. They published the story along with the video footage, and it quickly went viral. People were horrified, just like I was. There was an outcry for justice, and pressure mounted on the authorities to do something. For the first time, I felt like there was a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Aglara Pharmaceuticals would be held accountable for their actions. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be easy. They had a lot of power and resources, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. It's been a few weeks since the story was published, and things have been chaotic. There have been protests and calls for investigations. The authorities are finally taking notice, but it's still unclear what will happen. Aglara Pharmaceuticals has denied everything, of course, claiming the video is fake and part of a smear campaign. I'm still scared, but I'm also determined. I can't let them get away with this. I'll keep fighting, no matter what it takes. If anyone out there has more information or can help in any way, please reach out. We have to stop Aglara Pharmaceuticals before they do more harm. Despite the initial momentum, the fight against Aglara started to slow down. The media cycle moved on, and the public's attention shifted to other issues. I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. I knew I couldn't do this alone, so I reached out to advocacy groups and organizations that fought against corporate corruption. I contacted human rights organizations, legal aid societies, and independent watchdogs. Some of them showed interest, but most were hesitant to take on such a powerful corporation. However, a few brave souls agreed to help. They provided me with resources and advice on how to proceed. With their help, I started digging deeper. I spent countless hours researching and reaching out to former employees of Aglara Pharmaceuticals. Many of them were too scared to talk, but a few agreed to share their stories anonymously. They confirmed my worst fears. Aglara had been conducting illegal experiments for years, and they had powerful connections that helped them cover it up. One former employee provided me with internal documents that detailed some of the experiments. The documents were horrifying. They described in detail the effects of various drugs on human subjects, including the one I had witnessed. The level of cruelty was unimaginable. With the new evidence, I felt more confident. I compiled everything into a comprehensive dossier and presented it to the journalist. He was impressed with the amount of information I had gathered and agreed to write a follow-up story. This time, we had concrete evidence, documents, testimonials, and the chilling video footage. The journalist published the follow-up story, and it caused an even bigger uproar. Major news outlets picked it up, and the public outcry grew louder. People started demanding that the government take action against Aglara. Protests erupted outside their headquarters, and the pressure on the authorities intensified. Finally, the government announced an official investigation into Aglara Pharmaceuticals. It was a small victory, but I knew the fight was far from over. Aglara had deep pockets and influential friends. They would do everything in their power to obstruct the investigation and discredit the evidence. I continued to work with the journalist and the advocacy groups, providing them with any new information I could find. We were determined to see this through, no matter the cost. The investigation dragged on for months, and there were times when I felt like we were getting nowhere. But we kept pushing, refusing to give up. Just when I was starting to lose hope, we got a breakthrough. One of the scientists who had worked on the experiments came forward. He had left Aglara and was willing to testify about what he had seen. His testimony was the smoking gun we needed. The scientist described in gruesome detail how the experiments were conducted. He confirmed everything I had witnessed and more. He talked about the unethical practices, the disregard for human life, and the lengths Aglara went to cover it up. His testimony was a turning point in the investigation. With the scientist's testimony and the mountain of evidence we had gathered, the government had no choice but to take action. Aglara Pharmaceuticals was charged with multiple counts of illegal human experimentation, manslaughter, and conspiracy. Several high-ranking executives were arrested, and the company's assets were frozen. The trial was long and arduous, but in the end, justice prevailed. Aglara Pharmaceuticals was found guilty on all counts. The company was dismantled, and the executives were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. It was a bittersweet victory. Nothing could bring back the lives that had been lost, but at least there was some measure of accountability. After the trial, I tried to move on with my life. The whole experience had taken a toll on me, both physically and mentally. I still had nightmares about what I had seen, and there were days when I felt overwhelmed by guilt and sorrow. But I knew I had done the right thing. I had helped to expose a terrible truth and bring a powerful corporation to justice. I decided to go back to school and finish my journalism degree. I wanted to continue my father's legacy and use my skills to fight for truth and justice. To everyone who followed my journey, thank you. Your support and encouragement kept me going during the darkest times. We showed that even the most powerful corporations can be held accountable when we stand together and refuse to back down. There will always be more battles to fight, more injustices to expose. But I believe that as long as we keep pushing for the truth, we can make a difference. This is the Curator. I hope you've enjoyed today's scary stories. Until next time,